Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, today we're going to revisit a classic subject on this channel. We're going to delve balls deep into the realm of mythology and New Age mystical woo. That's right, we're going to be talking about the fictitious condition known as post-finasteride syndrome. Post-finasteride syndrome is defined as side effects from finasteride that persist or even start after stopping finasteride, and these side effects are supposedly permanent. So it's not to be confused with side effects from finasteride that just occur while taking the drug and that disappear with continued use of the drug or after stopping the drug. Like with any drug, there is a small incidence of side effects from using finasteride, but like with almost every drug known to humankind, these side effects stop when the drug washes out of the system. Post-finasteride syndrome is the notion that finasteride effects somehow stick around when the drug is gone and through unknown mechanisms cause permanent harm to the body. This is similar to what people who believe in homeopathy believe, that if you dilute a drug solution to the point that there isn't a single molecule left of the drug, somehow the drug effect still remains. Yes, it sounds crazy because it is crazy. Post-finasteride syndrome is similar to other fake conditions out there like adrenal fatigue, leaky gut syndrome, and candida hypersensitivity syndrome in the sense that there is no evidence it exists, yet it still gains a lot of support on social media due to people claiming anecdotally that they have it, and this has resulted in algorithmic bubbles across the internet. In those bubbles, people have established safe spaces where they can talk to other internet crazies who are deluded enough to believe their own conspiracy theories. Simply put, the medical community does not officially recognize the existence of post-finasteride syndrome. The people who claim to have it are self-diagnosed, even though they are not qualified to diagnose themselves, and the problems that they claim they are experiencing, such as low libido or brain fog after stopping the drug, are either problems that are caused by other factors, or they're experiencing a nocebo effect as a result of buying into all the fear-mongering about finasteride online. Now, as with any scientific or medical consensus, you're always going to find a few contrarians even within the medical and scientific community. This is true of any well-established scientific concept. There are doctors out there who deny vaccines are safe, there are climatologists who deny the existence of climate change, and likewise, there are dermatologists who claim that post-finasteride syndrome is a real thing. Of course, people are entitled to believe what they want, but just because an expert believes something doesn't mean it's true. The burden of proof still needs to be established regardless of whether or not you have a PhD or an MD. For instance, a lot of research that supports the notion of post-finasteride syndrome comes from two specific doctors. These doctors are Dr. Earwig and Dr. Trash. These two doctors' research is cited by proponents of the post-finasteride syndrome conspiracy theory literally all the goddamn time. The people who promote their research don't actually make any effort to scrutinize and properly interpret the research. They just read the abstract, and if they find it agreeable with their agenda, they'll use it to spread fear and misinformation about finasteride online. Supporters of post-finasteride syndrome are not interested in evidence. Nothing in the universe could convince them that post-finasteride syndrome is fake. They're just looking for confirmation bias because ultimately they're extremely jealous of all the people who use finasteride and don't get any adverse effects. Either that or they're too scared to even start the drug to begin with, so they need to find anything negative they can about finasteride in order to help themselves cope with their decision not to use it, and that includes trying to scare other people out of using the drug, because the last thing they want is to hear any more success stories about finasteride that will violate their safe space where they're convinced there's no possible way anyone could possibly have a good experience with this drug long term. So like I said, all the research which claims that post-finasteride syndrome exists is absolutely awful in its methodology and is tainted by massive problems involving selection bias, since most of the subjects chosen from these studies were handpicked by the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation as well as the Propecia Help Forums. So if you set out to do research with the intent of publishing negative outcome data, then you can easily do this if you select subjects who already have a negative opinion of the treatment to begin with, and that is exactly what the PFS Foundation is all about. They have an agenda to make finasteride look bad, and no facts to the contrary are going to get in their way of their crusade to make finasteride look as terrible as they claim it is. So It came to my attention recently that the PFS Foundation has expanded to YouTube, and they opened up a channel called the PFS Network. I ignored most of the content at first because there was nothing on it that warranted a response. Basically, most of the videos on that channel are just sob stories from random nobodies who just tell anecdotes about how finasteride supposedly ruined their life, and there is absolutely no value to any of this since there is no way to verify any of their anecdotes. Anecdotes can be published in the scientific literature as case reports, but case reports are close to the bottom of the pyramid of levels of scientific evidence. In all these anecdotes, there is no way to verify if the reported symptoms were really caused by finasteride or were unrelated to finasteride. For all we know, these people sobbing on the post-finasteride syndrome network may very well just be outright shills for the organization and are outright lying about what happened to them or people they know who were allegedly harmed by using finasteride. So there was nothing worth responding to, and I ignored the channel for the most part. Recently though, the channel has attempted to justify its outlandish claims about post-finasteride syndrome through a video which purports that the scientific research proves that post-finasteride syndrome is real, and there has been some grand cover-up to keep this knowledge secret, maybe by the Illuminati or something, I guess. So the video I am talking about specifically, which I'll link below, is titled, quote, "Finasteride caused persistent side effects in trials. 20 years later, men are still mostly unaware," unquote. It's extremely hard for me to believe that men are unaware given all the blatant propaganda the PFS Foundation likes to put out. Or maybe the real reason they're unaware is because post-finasteride syndrome doesn't exist. It is an alt-right QAnon conspiracy theory. But despite that, let's go ahead and give the PFS Network a chance to explain itself and find out what sort of evidence they can come up with to support their crazy claims.
Hi, it's Mitch from PFS Network.
Hey, how you doing, Mitch? Nice to meet you, man.
And today I'm going to be speaking to you about something which has not been covered well. That drug manufacturer Merck has been aware that their drug finasteride can cause persistent adverse effects in some men that continue even after stopping the drug since their clinical trials performed all the way back in the 1990s.
Really? Those bastards! Please tell us more, Mitch.
But today we'll be talking about the 2019 investigation by media giant Reuters into Merck's clinical trials for finasteride in the 1990s that discovered internal company documents,
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention to what you were saying. I was wondering what that strange sound was in the background. Either someone flushed the toilet or someone is stealing your car. But please continue. You were saying something about Reuters?
Merck knew about adverse effects that could persist even after discontinuation of the drug and have deliberately misled consumers, healthcare practitioners, and the general public for over 20 years.
So you heard all of that, despite the fact that finasteride has been on the market since 1992 and is an FDA-approved drug with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of clinical research showing that it is both safe and effective. They've actually been hiding secret documents from us this whole time, which show that the drug is really extremely dangerous. And Reuters has exposed Merck, who are the manufacturers of finasteride, as being involved in a massive conspiracy to mislead consumers about the safety of their product.
And if I was a consumer looking for information on Google search about potential side effects of finasteride, the Reuters story, the investigation, none of this information even comes up in the search results.
You say there isn't any good information about post-finasteride syndrome when you look it up on Google. You're wrong about that though. Last time I went to Google video search, I typed in post-finasteride syndrome and I found several of my own videos, including one listed on the very first page. So you're wrong. There is good information about post-finasteride syndrome. My information! I have made several videos about post-finasteride syndrome and they all show up in either the first or subsequent page on Google video search. In fact, my videos about post-finasteride syndrome on Google search are even listed above Joe Rogan's video about it. So I'd like to be given at least a little credit here for all I have contributed to the post-finasteride syndrome theory. Those previous videos I made on post-finasteride syndrome are listed below, by the way, in case you haven't seen them yet.
And finally, many clinicians or asymptomatic users of the drug often dismiss the existence of persistent adverse effects or post-finasteride syndrome by pointing to the clinical trials as proof that on-drug side effects are rare and that there is no evidence of persistent adverse effects that continue after stopping the drug.
Yeah, I agree. Let's go ahead and just ignore those clinical trials that involve thousands of subjects, hundreds of millions of dollars, and years of follow-up data that demonstrated that finasteride is effective and has a low risk of side effects, as well as no evidence of persistent side effects at all. Why would I listen to FDA clinical trials when I could listen to someone crying about finasteride making their anus numb on Propecia help forums instead? That is clearly more convincing evidence than clinical trials conducted by actual researchers using scientifically proven methodologies. But apparently, Mitch did his own research, so by all means, please continue, good sir.
That there has been evidence of persistent adverse effects that can continue after stopping the drug as far back as the late 1990s.
Well, I can tell there is at least one effect of finasteride that hasn't been persistent here. If finasteride's effects are permanent, then why don't you still have your hair, young man? Oh, I guess it's only the bad things that are permanent. I'm sure that makes a lot of sense to everybody.
In a 5-year study that involved 323 men, at least one man experienced persistent sexual dysfunction after discontinuing the drug. That's according to an email sent by Patrick Ruane, medical program coordinator who coordinated the trials for Propecia, to Dr. Keith Kaufman, the clinical head of Propecia who oversaw the trials.
So Mitch then brings up the highest tier in scientific evidence, even higher than a randomized control trial in terms of the strength of its scientific evidence. He brings up an email. And this email is from, well, who gives a shit? But anyways, the email says that in the phase 3 trials, there were 6 people who stopped finasteride due to sexual side effects, and in 5 of these people, the sexual side effects resolved on their own. But in one person, the side effects continued up to 66 days after stopping treatment. In fact, in the deposition that Mitch brings up next, the sexual dysfunction was still present 6 months after stopping finasteride. So I guess this would constitute strong evidence if you come from a forum where people can claim finasteride changed their sexual orientation and still be taken seriously. But in terms of academic research, this pretty much says nothing at all. We're talking about one person out of hundreds of people. In the real world, as opposed to the fantasy world the PFS Foundation lives in, the fact that the sexual dysfunctions were still there 6 months later would be strong evidence that the sexual dysfunction was not due to finasteride. After all, finasteride only has a 6-hour half-life. 6 months after cessation of the drug represents roughly 720 half-lives for elimination of the drug, according to my calculations at least. There probably isn't a single finasteride molecule left in the body after 6 months. For all we know, this one subject had sexual dysfunction from some other cause. There is no proof of any causative role of finasteride causing his erectile dysfunction, especially since erectile dysfunction is a very common and multifactorial condition which affects up to 30% of all men at some point in their lives. So if this email is supposed to be some big smoking gun, then it's as big of a letdown as the final season of Game of Thrones.
Ruane also tells Kaufman in that same email that during years 3 to 5 of the study, 23 patients experienced drug-related sexual adverse events. Now, Ruane tells Kaufman that 16 of those patients had adverse events resolve, but that the adverse events remained for 7 men even after they discontinued the study. Now, in his deposition, Kaufman then says that Merck had no way of knowing when or if those adverse events resolved for those 7 patients.
So then apparently there were 7 patients who at the end of the study had adverse events, but Merck didn't follow up with them to see if these events resolved after the study was over. Well, great. These were patients who were lost to follow-up, which happens all the time with studies. I mean, once the study is over, people usually want to get on with their lives, but it's a lot to swallow to believe that the side effects didn't resolve on their own in those subjects. I mean, other than the one subject we already mentioned who had side effects for 6 months, there had already been thousands of subjects studied in multiple trials, and in none of them was there any evidence of persistent side effects. So we're somehow supposed to believe these 7 men weren't like all the other subjects who just had transient side effects and their side effects were somehow permanent. I mean, wouldn't you think at least one of these 7 men would maybe check back in with Merck and say, hey Merck, you know that study drug I was on that gave me side effects? Well, guess what? I'm still having those goddamn side effects. But no, this didn't happen. These people just went about their business, and I would say it is a safe assumption that their side effects resolved over time.
Ruane also tells Kaufman in that same email that
I am sorry, I know this is a totally random thing to say, but this has really been bothering me. Does anyone know what the hell that nightmarish thing is on his shelf over there? Is that a severed hand? Is it made out of wood? Why would somebody have something like this in their house? That is really weird. But anyways, it's off topic, but if anyone knows what that is, please tell me because it's really creeping me out.
They made a small but very significant change to the warning label for Propecia in 2002. They changed the warning label from saying resolution occurred in all men who discontinued Propecia to resolution occurred in men who discontinued Propecia.
So he then brings up that because of this uncertainty about the existence of long-term side effects from finasteride, which was essentially based on the anecdotal experience of just one patient, Merck changed the warning label for finasteride in a way that at least suggests there might be a possibility of long-term side effects. It's important to emphasize, though, that they were pressured into doing this for legal reasons, not scientific reasons. They were afraid of getting sued by people claiming to have long-term side effects, and lawsuits are expensive to fight regardless of whether or not they are frivolous. As it turns out, though, this just backfired completely on Merck, because by not taking an affirmative stance on their product finasteride not causing long-term side effects, this ended up in the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation being formed, and Merck started getting sued left and right. To quote an article on this phenomenon from 2019, quote, shortly after Merck revised its label, thousands or perhaps hundreds of thousands of websites claimed that Propecia and finasteride cause erectile dysfunction and loss of libido. In addition, dozens of lawsuits and support group websites were formed, unquote. Here are the search results from Google looking at finasteride side effects.
So next, the revised warning label omits nearly all of the experiences of those 23 patients that I just mentioned, and only reports on the experiences of patients who took the drug in the first year of research and those who took it continuously for all 5 years. So they did not include the experiences of men who dropped out before the 5 years had finished, including those who dropped out in the final 3 years of research due to sexual side effects.
Mitch then quibbles about whether the warning label includes subjects from the last years of the 5-year study and how the subjects who dropped out of the study were handled, but this has nothing to do with persistent side effects. I think he is trying to make the case that there are more side effects than are being reported in the warning label, but like I thoroughly reviewed in my video on finasteride side effects, which I'll link below, there are literally dozens of studies on the incidence of finasteride side effects involving thousands of subjects, and the bottom line is that finasteride increases the risk of sexual side effects by about just 1 or 2 percentage points. So not that big of a disaster that Mitch would like you to believe. And again, none of these studies supports the idea that these side effects are permanent. But anyways, let's get back to Mitch as he rambles further about this drug.
Next, according to a deposition from former VP of Marketing at Merck, Paul Howes, before the launch of Propecia, Merck had several patents expiring in the late 1990s to early 2000s that put at least half of its US revenue from 4 key drugs at risk. He also acknowledged that Propecia had the potential to be a blockbuster drug.
He then implies that Merck intentionally covered up the data on the possibility of long-term side effects because, evil big pharma conspiracy, blah, 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 and finasteride had the potential to be a blockbuster drug. Now, I, of course, don't doubt that Merck and its stockholders are interested in making money, but it's a James Bond villain or Dr. Evil level of malfeasance to think that Merck was suppressing data deliberately just to make sure that finasteride would get approved. This is just conspiracy level of thinking and assumes the hundreds of scientists working for Merck just decided to go along with it, which there is absolutely no evidence of.
The only time a Merck executive questions the validity of this man's experiences is Paul Howes during his deposition, where he says it's possible that the man and others already had sexual dysfunction before the trial. Now that's a fair point, but immediately the plaintiff's lawyer addresses this by telling Mr. Howes that Merck precluded anyone from the trial with prior sexual dysfunction.
I object, Your Honor. We know that people will not always be forthcoming when it comes to a highly personal issue like erectile dysfunction, and it is also plausible that people would lie about a condition they knew would cause them to be excluded from a study where they would get access to a drug that could save their hair. Keep in mind, back then, the only other option we had for saving our hair was 2% minoxidil, which is not nearly as effective as finasteride, so you'd expect people would go through desperate measures, including lying to get into trials so they can get their hands on this hair-saving drug. Also, clinical trials last years, so it is very possible for people to develop sexual dysfunction from other causes within that time. This is particularly true of phase 4 trials, which are post-marketing trials, meaning they occur after the drug is released. These are retrospective trials that don't have a control group and are based on self-reported side effects. So it is certainly possible that some people on finasteride can develop sexual dysfunction due to other causes. And of course, these issues will persist after stopping the drug because they're not related to the drug. In fact, most of the time when something thought to be a side effect occurs with a drug, the best way to see if it is related to the drug is to stop the drug and see if it goes away. But I guess finasteride doesn't get that benefit of the doubt here like any other drug because these guys want everyone to believe that finasteride side effects are permanent. In fact, their organization's existence is contingent on that belief, even though there is no prospective controlled studies that show this to be true.
Now, as we know from this litigation and numerous other public mentions, Merck has since sought to blame persistent dysfunction being reported by men on numerous other factors such as their baldness, prior depressive history, even smoking.
That all sounds perfectly reasonable to me. Baldness is an extremely mentally debilitating condition which can lead to depression, and depression has been confirmed to cause erectile dysfunction. Same thing with smoking, which can cause vascular damage to the arteries that supply blood to the penis. So what Merck is saying here is entirely justifiable. Sexual dysfunction is caused by many different factors, including both psychosomatic causes like depression, as well as physical causes like high blood pressure, which can be caused by smoking.
And we know that clinicians have sought to mischaracterize post-finasteride syndrome as a delusional disorder caused by stimulated reporting. We know that cannot be the case here because such reporting didn't exist.
So he brings up the famous Trüeb article, which was a case report of someone with supposed post-finasteride syndrome, and Trüeb shows that it was the subject's exposure to anti-finasteride propaganda online which was responsible for his symptoms. Even though this is just a case report, it is corroborated by the thousands of anecdotes of screaming, crybaby, neck-bearded perma-virgins online who blame finasteride on the fact that they cannot get laid. With all due respect to you, Mitch, have you ever met a normal person who claims to have post-finasteride syndrome? I mean, you keep a severed hand on your goddamn bookshelf for crying out loud. In Trüeb's paper, the individual was so fixated on the idea that finasteride ruined his life that he even showed anger and rage at people who dared to even suggest that his symptoms must have been because of a nocebo effect or from some other cause. And this is reflective of the behavior of people within the post-finasteride syndrome community in general. They describe symptoms which are either laughably stupid, such as claiming finasteride made them transgender, or they'll describe symptoms that are so common that there is no way to single out finasteride use as being the culprit that caused it. Yet despite this, they will get downright livid at anyone who dares to question their fanatical obsession with slandering this drug as well as its proponents as much as they possibly can. This is why you PFS guys are still suffering. It's because you don't realize that the people who deny post-finasteride syndrome are actually trying to help you, because the sooner you abandon your delusions about this drug, the sooner you can focus on finding real psychological help for all of your problems. He says that the one guy with sexual dysfunction that persisted after stopping finasteride could not have had a nocebo effect because post-finasteride syndrome hadn't been reported yet. Well, sure, maybe that's true of this one guy who may have had sexual dysfunction from any number of causes not related to finasteride use. However, that's ancient history now. Today, there's a huge problem with people getting a nocebo effect due to online misinformation and fear-mongering, just like in this video. And there's no doubt that this has resulted in many men losing the opportunity to save their hair when they still had a chance. And it is an absolute shame that the basis for all this misinformation is just because of this one guy out of thousands of patients who were studied with finasteride and whose symptoms could have been from anything for all we know. Simply put, this is just an anecdote, and there's nothing to verify finasteride had anything to do with any of this guy's problems.
If you consider that 29 of the 323 men involved in the 5-year study experienced side effects, that's 8.9%, not 3.8%. I will concede, however, that the warning label does include some limited information about post-marketing experiences.
He then wastes more time complaining about the package labeling, saying the percentage of side effects at the 5th year is lower than it should be because it didn't count subjects who dropped out. And like one of the emails he shows says, there are different ways to interpret and present this data. This warning label was approved by the FDA, so it can't be that far off. Thank goodness also there are, like I mentioned, dozens of studies looking at finasteride side effects. Good doctors read the actual literature and not just the warning label of a drug. But Mitch is also conflating two separate issues here. The first is what the incidence of side effects from finasteride is. The second issue is whether finasteride can cause long-term side effects. He is sort of saying, look, they got the incidence of side effects in the 5th year wrong, so they must have gotten wrong that finasteride doesn't cause long-term side effects. He's basically just saying, yeah, go ahead and change that percentage value for the risk of side effects at year 5, and while you're at it, throw in something about how finasteride causes permanent side effects, okay? Thanks, Chooms.
And finally, it also shows that it's pretty obvious and has already been called out in several studies that there was inadequate safety reporting in Merck's clinical trials for finasteride for hair loss.
He then mentions this study, which purportedly shows that the finasteride clinical trials did not meet adequate safety monitoring standards. In the study published in 2015, the authors analyzed 34 studies of finasteride and found that none fully met their safety monitoring criteria, though 56% partially met the criteria, while 35% were, quote, inadequate, and 9% reported no adverse effects. Of course, many of the trials were rather small, so it's not surprising some of them reported no adverse side effects from finasteride. But is finasteride an outlier here? Was Merck just sloppy, or did they not care about their drug safety at all? Well, let's see how other clinical trials of other drugs measure up here. The safety monitoring criteria they used to evaluate finasteride studies was published by a Dr. Ioannidis, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because he unfortunately ruined his reputation when at the start of the COVID pandemic, he predicted at most 10,000 Americans would die from COVID, as well as promoting other fringe COVID skeptic ideas that anti-vax morons like to frequently cite. But when he published this article in 2001, back then he was still considered a reputable scientist. Anyways, in his study, he looked at 192 large randomized controlled drug trials of different drugs and found that there was adequate safety monitoring, at least by his standards, in only 39% of drug trials. So, safety monitoring during drug trials is, of course, important and could always be improved. But remember, the finasteride phase 3 trials were performed way back in the early 1990s, and it looks like the majority of drug trials were no different from the finasteride trials in terms of the adequacy of safety monitoring. So there is no vast conspiracy on Merck's part to cover up some secret safety issue with finasteride. Sure, they wanted their drug to look good and they wanted to make money from it, but it's a big leap to conclude from this that they are evilly plotting to make men permanently impotent, which is what Mitch would likely have you believe. No, they were just following the same standard procedure of the majority of other companies trying to approve their own drugs back then.
And despite all of this, there is still fierce resistance from drug manufacturers like Merck, other hair loss companies, dermatologists, and users of the drug to the existence of post-finasteride syndrome or potential persistent adverse effects, or that the condition is a delusional disorder caused by stimulated reporting about finasteride.
In other words, the resistance is from 99% of everybody who is not a QAnon conspiracy capital insurrectionist. Just like any good conspiracy, though, you have to be in the minority fighting back against the oppressive majority, which in this case is, of course, big pharma plus big dermatology, and all those evil finasteride users who didn't get side effects and aren't afraid to share their positive experiences with the drug, like myself. When you come right down to this, though, Mitch's whole thesis is based on the testimonial of just one patient out of the thousands that were involved in the clinical trials. When you take this fact and then mix in an unhealthy dose of paranoia about big pharma, eagerness to win big bucks from lawsuits, online fear-mongering, and anger at normal finasteride users who take the drug without any problems, then the result from this mess is the absolute clusterfuck which goes by the name of the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation, or network, or whatever it is they want to be called these days. So, not to be an asshole and paint a pessimistic outlook for you guys from the PFS Network, but I think the medical community is going to take you guys about as seriously as people who claim taking a horse deworming medication can cure COVID-19. Now, Drug companies, of course, aren't perfect. They do have a profit motive, but that's why we have proper regulation to keep their greed in check. The FDA is the most stringent organization in the world when it comes to regulating treatment, and that is why getting FDA approval, as finasteride has done, is considered the gold standard when it comes to ensuring a drug is effective and safe for what it is prescribed for. Furthermore, we also have phase 4 clinical trials which can pull a drug off the market if any evidence ever comes out during post-marketing that shows that the drug is dangerous. We have seen this before happen with drugs like Vioxx when they hit the market, but then they were pulled off the market a couple years later due to its causal link to heart disease, which was established. Finasteride has been on the market since 1992, though, when it was first approved at a dose of 5 milligrams per day for enlarged prostate, which is 5 times the dose it's prescribed at for hair loss, and none of these original studies showed any evidence of persistent sexual side effects due to finasteride usage. The PFS Foundation, PFS Network, and the Propecia Health Forums are all basically just a big AstroTurf organization. They claim to be on the side of consumers, but in reality, they are a profit-oriented business whose prosperity is contingent on people believing their lies about finasteride. The fact is, though, they're not helping people. They're hurting people by scaring them off from their best chance to save their hair, and it is sad to think about the thousands of people who could have taken finasteride and would have had no issue with the drug, but who are now as bald, miserable, and sexless as they are because they are driven away from the drug because of the fear that the PFS Foundation likes to spread. Contrary to what Mitch says about there being a lot of pro-finasteride content on YouTube, the opposite is actually true. My channel is one of the very few that is willing to speak positively about this drug and push back against the propaganda organizations like the PFS Network like to promote. Sadly, it's not just the PFS Network that spreads this kind of hysteria. Even hair loss forums, which ironically are intended to help people fight hair loss, end up propagating the very same type of misinformation about finasteride. So people seeking hair loss advice should really just stay off the internet and consult with their doctors. They're the ones qualified to diagnose you and put you on a proper therapeutic plan to stop your hair loss. They're the ones who can help you, not the PFS Foundation and not any hair loss forum or subreddit. The fact is, most people who have a positive experience with finasteride will just take the drug and get on with their lives. For those who experience side effects, they almost always can be handled by titrating the drug doses, such as using 0.5 or 0.25 milligrams daily, or even every other day. And in the very rare cases that this doesn't work, side effects will always go away when you stop finasteride, though that is rarely necessarily since the drug can be titrated to be used by just about everybody. So with the power of finasteride, almost everybody can save their hair, but it's just a matter of avoiding these dubious sources online that are trying to convince you that the best drug ever made to stop hair loss is not a viable or safe option. The fact is, though, is that if you use finasteride, there is a small chance you won't respond well to it. However, if you don't use finasteride, there is a very, very good chance you'll look like this. It's up to you to decide what the greater risk is, but don't let yourself be fooled. These people have zero interest in your well-being. They have an agenda to push, and it doesn't matter in the slightest if you end up as collateral damage in the process.
Well, welcome to the show, sir. Take it away and give it your best shots.
Hello, lady. My name is Emmett, and I'm from Roscommon.
Tell us, are you turned on or turned off?
Shocking.
Ooh.
No, I'm not.
Shannon, lights off for you as well. I'm doing my best for you here.
It's just the hair, the lack of, I'm sorry.
Nadine, what happened?
He kind of looks a bit old and he's baldy like me dad and no.
Okay.
Don't let this happen to you, chooms. Ignore all the fearmongers and hairline fraud cells online. Talk to your doctor, get on finasteride, save your hair, and get on with your life. The hardest part about fighting the good fight against hair loss is just starting the battle to begin with. Once you pass that obstacle, it's smooth sailing, and chances are you'll look back and laugh at the fact that you were ever afraid of finasteride to begin with. And with that, good luck on the path, my fellow hair loss witchers. I'll see you next time. Take care.